Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This is Chapter 12, Alice's Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting in a flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen and their heads of the crowd below. And there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she'd accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had some vague sort of idea that she must collect them all at once and put them back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king, in a very grave notice, "until all the jurymen have been put back in their proper places." "All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he did so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail in a melancholy way, quite unable to move. She soon got out again herself and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils were found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out the history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too overcome to do anything but sit there with his mouth open, gazing up at the roof of the court. "Now, what do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatever," persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him while he spoke. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king added hastily, and went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he was trying which word sounded the best. Some of the jury wrote down important, and some wrote unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over their slates, but it doesn't matter much, she thought to herself. At this point, the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read from his book, "Rule 42. All persons over a mile high must leave the court." Everyone looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You just invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come yet, please, your majesty," if the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What's in it?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it's written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know." "Who's it directed to?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the White Rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke, and added, "It isn't a letter at all. It's actually a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" said another of the jurymen. "No, they're not," said the White Rabbit. "That's the queerest thing about it." And the jury all looked puzzled. "He must have imitated somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury all brightened up again. "Please, your majesty," said the knave, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove that I did. There's no name signed at the end." "If you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you would have signed your name like an honest man." And there was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said all day. "That proves his guilt, of course," said the king. "So off!" "That doesn't prove anything of the sort," said Alice. "Why don't you even know what this is all about?" "Read them," said the king, and the White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin, please, your majesty?" he asked. "Begin at the beginning," the king said gravely, "and go on until the end, and then stop." There was a dead silence in the court while the White Rabbit read out the verses. "They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him, so she gave a good character, but I said I could not swim. He sent Then word I had not gone, we know it to be true. If she should push the matter on you, what then would become of you? I gave her one, and then I gave him two. You gave us three or more, and they all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free exactly as we were. My notion was that if you had been, before she had seen this fit, an obstacle that came between him, ourselves, and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must be ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me. That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet, said the king, rubbing his hands. So now let the jury. If of them can explain it, said Alice. She'd grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. I'll give him a sixpence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. The jury wrote down on their slates. She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it, but none of them attempted to explain the paper. If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves a world of trouble. As you know, we needn't find any. And yet I don't know, he went on, spreading the verses out on his knee and looking at them with one eye. I seem to see there's some meaning in it, after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you? He added, and he turned to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like it? He said, which certainly he did not, being entirely made of cardboard. All right, so far, said the king. And then we went over muttering the verses to himself. We know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. If she should push the matter on him, that must be the queen. What would become of you? What indeed? I gave her one, I gave her two. Why, that must be the tarts, you know. But it does go on. They all returned from him to you, said Alice. Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing at the tarts on the table. Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit, you never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen. Never, said the queen, furiously, and throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger, and as he soon found it made no mark, he had hastily began again using the ink which was trickling down his face as long as it lasted. Then the words don't fit you, said the king, looking round at the court with a smile, and there was a dead silence. It's a pun, the king added in an angry tone, and everyone laughed. Let the jury consider the verdict, the king said, and for about the 20th time today. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, said the queen, turning purple. I won't. Off with her head, said the queen as she shouted at the top of her voice, but nobody moved. Who cares for you? She had grown to her full size by this time. You're nothing but a pack of cards. And at this, the whole pack rose up in the air and came flying down upon her, and she gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and she tried to beat them off, and she found herself lying on the bank with her head in the lap of her sisters, who were gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down the trees. Wake up, Alice, dear, said her sister. Why, what a long sleep you've had. Oh, I've had such a curious dream, said Alice. And she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all about the adventures of hers that she'd been reading about and what she'd finished. And her sister kissed her and said, That was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run in to your tea. It's getting late. So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she'd run, as she as well as she might, what a wonderful dream had been. But her sister sat still just as she had left, leaning on her head on her hand and watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all of her wonderful adventures, till too she began dreaming after a fashion, and this was her first dream. First she dreamt about little Alice herself. Once again, the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers, and she could hear the very tones of her voices, and see that the queer little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And as still as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with strange creatures from her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by, and the frightened mouse splashed his way through a neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared an never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering her unfortunate guest's execution. Once more, the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee while the plates and dishes crashed around it. Once more, the shriek of the griffin and the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sob of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on with her eyes closed and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew that she had begun to open them again and all would change into a dull reality. The grass would only be the rustling wind and the pool a rippling of the waving reeds. The rattling teacups would be the tinkling of sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cry the voice of the shepherd boy. The sneeze of the baby and the shriek of the griffin were all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, and the low lowing of cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured herself how the same little sister of hers would, after a time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep through all her riper years the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how they would gather about other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many strange tales, perhaps even of this dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end.